Hi, Mark.
Morning, Ross. Morning, Ross. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good. Are you considering this summer or fall?
I'm considering this very much summer.
Okay, I think that's the great
even
division
even though it's only 86 degrees in Washington
Right.
instead of the usual 97.
Yeah.
So does this feel like fall to you?
Well, here's the thing. This is a week where Washington's divided into two great classes. For the Washington with children, it's the first week of fall. For those of you who are childless, it's the last week of summer.
Wait, so public
schools have started
this
schools
week?
have started this week.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yep, so everything's back to normal. In
Oh,
our households.
I'm glad. I assume that's good news for the Schmitt family. That your time is your own now.
It's all good. It's all good.
All right. Well, I still self-identify not with parents, but with the poor kids who have to go back to school before Labor Day, and that seems to me.
Some of them love it.
Some of them love it.
I haven't caught on yet that they're, being ground down to being tools of the man's machine.
Well, there's time enough for them to figure that out. That no matter how high you rise, it can all end like Alberto Gonzales in a matter of moments.
Right. Or Larry Craig.
Or Larry Craig, for that matter.
Yeah. The two great downfalls yesterday, and you sort of think sometimes they time these news stories so that here's this distraction is a distraction from something else. My theory of the Gonzales resignation was it was a distraction from all the stuff about the Petraeus report, and and I think the possibility of a lot of Republicans coming back from recess with a changed position on the war, so they threw up Gonzales, and then to divert attention from Gonzales, they threw up Larry Craig.
How did the Larry Craig story actually come out? Because this incident happened right in June. Is that
right? It happened in June, and he actually pleaded guilty on August 8th. And last night I saw something on Talking Points memo that said that he had that he had made a mistake. He decided he made a mistake by pleading guilty, which is probably true. But presumably it's one of those things that's a mistake because you've now been found out.
Right? Because
he pleaded guilty, presumably in the expectation that it would somehow be kept hush hush, and if it's not, then what's the point?
Well, and it seems to me that no one who, maybe this is just my lack of experience with airport bathroom sting operations, but it seems to me that no one who was actually innocent and was accused of soliciting sex in an airport bathroom would plead guilty. Does that sound right to you? Can you imagine
really.
A circumstance in which you were accused of soliciting sex in an airport bathroom and you decided that it was the right thing to do to plead guilty? I guess if you're a politician and you think you can. I think if the option was if you're a politician and it's pay $500 fine and this will never be heard of again versus have like a trial, as Larry Craig put it, right,
he said situation.
But how could he
have a massive trial in which your only defense was, I was sort of misunderstood? I wonder
how you could possibly think that this wouldn't come out in in the age of Talking Points memo, Gawker, and so on.
I think that's right. How do you think it would come out? What's always interesting to me in these situations is that when you hear about them, they always seem to play the "Do you know who I am?" card. That guy in Florida said, does it help that I'm a state senator? And Larry Craig pulled out his ID and said, does this change anything? And you sort of wonder. Probably if your life has involved, living in the, soliciting sex in public bathrooms, you might have been arrested more than once. And maybe half the time that does work. Maybe that's why they do it. You hear about it when it doesn't work, or maybe it's just that, you can't resist, I guess, trying to invoke that, which always adds such a little nasty, ugly twist to the story when they try to invoke that get out of jail free card.
But so, it all seems, essentially it was a sequence of foot tapping, right? That did him in. Right. And this is apparently the signals that you use, and then it ended with, and then they both tapped feet, and then the officer pushed his police ID under the urinal divider.
Right, and Larry Craig yelled no, and then he got arrested. I mean, you'd have a good defense. I mean, you should plead not.
It seems like you have a good
not
defense.
guilty. You're either entrapped. I mean, not. I mean, you're charged with lewd conduct, and you actually didn't do anything lewd.
He did nothing
right.
lewd, and it
Right.
seems to me that, I mean, maybe they get these kind of cases all the time, and it really is obvious that 5 foot taps followed by an accidental brush equates to I want oral sex. But
right.
as an outsider to this world, it all seems, I don't know. It seems like a case where you could pretty easily argue that you were
right.
just you were antsy. You were tapping your foot. People get antsy in the urinal. Sometimes I know lots of people who don't like.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me. I mean, there are two ways to look at this. One, I mean, this is a really old story, and it's part of it goes back a long way. It's part of entrenched homophobia, and it goes back a long way to there was an aide to LBJ who was arrested in a bathroom in Washington in the 60s. And it's kind of nasty stuff. On the other hand, I mean, certain bathrooms get known for a certain thing, and there's
right.
and people know that. And if you run an airport, you probably don't want one of your bathrooms to be known for that thing, and so you sort of have an interest, I think, in getting that out. I mean, you have to feel sorry for, a certain sympathy for somebody like Larry Craig.
I guess.
Not only not able to lead an open life, but probably being, very wary of doing it in Washington and very wary of doing it in Idaho. So some place like the Minneapolis airport is that perfect opportunity, rare opportunity to, whatever.
No, I mean it's true. You do clearly have to feel sorry for him. On the other hand, I mean, I think that a point that I would be remiss to not make because someone on the left would surely make it and be right in the sense that if to be a Republican senator in this day and age and to be a social conservative and so forth and
right.
to have these desires and find yourself unable to avoid acting on them.
Right.
I don't know. It seems to me you might consider, at the very least, you might consider somebody, I think, immediately found a statement of him praising, maybe it was Mitt Romney's strong family values and so on.
Absolutely.
You might at the very least, make sure never to issue any press statements that use the term family values, I guess.
Well, you might, and you might not vote for horrible legislation and so forth. But I sometimes think, I mean, hypocrisy, I think, gets a little overused a little bit. I mean, some of the, voting for, anti-gay legislation and things like that. It's bad whether you're gay or not gay. So I don't load so much more opprobrium on him because it's tied in with these other things. But you're coming up to the left of me on this one.
I know.
Not really. I mean, I don't have any. There actually, when I worked on the Hill, there was something. There was actually of all of those guys, there was something a little. I don't know. I worked for Bill Bradley. He was on the Energy Committee. I think Craig was the ranking member, was the chair at that time, or maybe he was the chair of the relevant subcommittee or whatever. But of all of those, hardcore Western conservatives, he was one of the easier ones to deal. He was a sort of, in a sense, a gentler soul, if I can.
If you can say that, yeah.
I mean, it was just sort of.
Well, I mean, no, and the Western conservatives. I mean,
yeah.
That's particularly the Upper West. That's where you get Alan Simpson.
Right.
I mean, I would say it's where you get Bob Packwood, but maybe that's not the example we want to bring in this case. But Bob Packwood was, both he and Hatfield were very socially liberal Republicans. But,
right.
Well, in any case, it seems like we don't have anything
he voted against part of the Patriot Act. I thought that was, I looked at it. I noticed that yesterday. So, but it does always make me think that sometimes, my little line is that the conservatives like to keep gay people in the closet because it's their recruiting office. And there's an awful lot of
Well, and this, if there is, I suppose we should try and make some big political point about this, but this is yet another example of why the Republican opposition to gay rights in their various manifestations is, I think, in the long term, a loser for the party, just because, among other things, Larry Craig, Mark Foley, and so forth.
Right. I mean, so as a social conservative yourself, you're able to draw. You're able to preserve your vision of social conservatism with a pretty broad sweep for gay rights. I mean, how does that fit into your own?
I mean, I think
thinking about
my sense of it has always been that from the point of view of social conservatives, the reason that gay rights became a political issue in a way that various other, frankly, much more important issues having to do with marriage and family life did not, particularly issues about divorce and heterosexual divorce rates and single parenthood and so forth, is that clearly, it's easier to demonize gay people.
Right.
And it's much more of an electoral winner. I mean, I think the broader conservative concern about family values in American life is correct. I think that the way that it's manifested itself in our political life has reflected the fact that nobody wants to be the guy out there telling people that, hey, your heterosexual marriage or your out-of-wedlock children are the problem. It's much easier to say, here's this particular manifestation that you can easily set aside and say, well, I'm not gay.
Right.
So to that extent, I mean, maybe this is wishful thinking on my part, but I think that it's possible that the social conservative proponents of gay marriage, the Jonathan Rauches and Andrew Sullivans and so forth, though I think calling Andrew a social conservative at this point is kind of a stretch. But the people making the conservative case for gay marriage might turn out to be right, that it could actually strengthen the sort of more practical side of social conservatism that's concerned with issues that affect 96% of Americans rather than 4% of Americans. But that's probably wishful thinking. It's more likely that it's just another step in a direction from which there's no going back from. I don't know.
Right. I mean, it's also a way to avoid, the things that would strengthen families that actually require investing. Which has been your argument in the past too. Investing in healthcare. It's not just like you do this other. It's not just like instead of banning gay marriage, you should have covenant marriage or make divorce, get rid of no-fault divorce or any of those things. It's affirmative stuff that costs money and requires some gesture towards liberalism, not something that you can enact by statute.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's clearly part of the appeal too.
Right.
So.
And Gonzales, I don't know what to say about Gonzales at this.
You don't? Well, you wanted to talk about Gonzales.
I put him on the agenda. What's to say about Gonzales?
I'll raise a question because a couple of liberal bloggers have raised it, which is, so Bush has to appoint a new attorney general, and a lot of people have said, well, he needs a unifying figure, maybe, another Robert Gates type appointment that would be an easy confirmation and would restore the credibility of the Justice Department and so on. And both Matt Iglesias and Brian Butler, I'm actually not sure how to pronounce his last name.
I think it's Butler, yeah.
Have argued that, in fact, no, at this point, Bush has an interest in, particularly after the immigration debacle, reconsolidating his base. There's no better way to do that than to nominate someone at least somewhat divisive, and particularly because the Attorney General's office has so much to do with the war on terror, you can cast this as a debate of, oh, look, Democrats, yet again standing in the way of the administration's ability to prosecute the war on terror. I think that has limited appeal to the general electorate, but it's true. Something like that might be a small part of reconsolidating the conservative base.
Right.
But I would also say, and this gets to the point you made at the beginning about, were they trying to take the question of Petraeus' report out of the headlines for a little while? I mean, I think from Bush's point of view right now, there's only one issue for the remainder of his presidency, and that's what's going on in Iraq. And I think my assumption is that we should expect that that the appointment of the next Attorney General will. The decision of whether to appoint someone divisive or appoint someone not divisive will have everything to do with what Bush thinks will help him get what he wants on the Iraq question.
Right.
And I suspect that will lead to appointing someone not that divisive. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that, I mean, it's hard to know at this point what would really excite the base. I mean, it is. I mean, Bush did, with those two Supreme Court appointments, he did manage to find, a perfect match of people who, actually did, even though they hadn't heard of them, they weren't that, they're not icons of the right, but they did sort of fully satisfy the base and managed to, be eminently confirmable. And so I'd be tempted to look at, like, judges that have been confirmed in the last, couple years, so that you can go in and say, look, you confirmed this person, not necessarily Janice Rogers Brown, although that would be awfully tempting, but getting close to that, and somebody who's been recently confirmed, just sort of thread that needle. And I think the Supreme Court nominations were a real reminder that when they can actually thread that needle. I mean, I think Sid Blumenthal has an article in Salon, which I think
be
really makes...
still my beating heart.
What's that?
Sorry, no, go on.
No, I think he makes it. I mean, you can whatever you can argue about Sid, but I think the point he made was that Rove and Gonzales were kind of joined at the hip, and they made the Justice Department an arm of the White House political operation. And when you take Rove out of the equation, you've kind of lost half of that partnership anyway. So Gonzales had to go at that point. I mean, I think the bigger issue for the White House is, can we put somebody in there who will kind of keep the lid on all the stuff that might otherwise come pouring out of the Justice Department? Because I do think we only know the tenth of it. And that would be essentially a kind of a crony. Or do you not, and do you reestablish, do you put, John Danforth would be a perfect candidate, for example. But John Danforth, the reason John Danforth hasn't had any of these appointments is because, he doesn't put up with rampant corruption. I think that's probably a better thing, probably more likely what they're looking at than just, are you going to excite the base or not? Because I'm not sure how much, at this point, you can excite the base. The other interesting question about Gonzales, by the way, I did a post on this on Tap like months ago. The interesting question is there have been a number of editorials this morning, and I interrupted you. I'll
no, I didn't have anything interesting to say. Go on.
Months ago, like the editorials this morning, some of them have referred to Gonzales as possibly the worst Attorney General or whatever. It's kind of amazing. He might be the worst Attorney General, but there have been an amazing number of really, really awful Attorney Generals in history. From John Mitchell and Richard Kleindienst and I had a list of these. There was like Harding's Attorney General was a pretty bad Attorney General, what were the Red Scare raids called? The begins with a P. Anyway, one of them did all those Red Scare raids, and then there was another one who was like the biggest redneck on the Supreme Court. In fact, he wouldn't. I can't remember his name either. It's McSomething. He wouldn't. McReynolds wouldn't address Justice. They had to cancel the Supreme Court photograph of the justices because he refused to stand next to Justice Brandeis. He never spoke one word to Justice Brandeis in the entire time they were on the Supreme Court together because he was so anti-Semitic. There have been just like a colossal number of very bad Attorney Generals. So I think so for Gonzales to achieve worst Attorney General is actually it's a lot harder it's a lot higher bar to cross than worst Transportation Secretary or worst Secretary of Energy. Or
well, and Gonzales, maybe you disagree since you think we've only heard a tenth of the stuff that's going to come out, but it doesn't seem to me. What Gonzales has been involved in is sort of cronyist hack work and politicization, which are bad things, but I think it's pretty easy to imagine attorney generals involved in worse things. And frankly, I think, again, all scandals are different and so forth, but he hasn't presided over anything nearly as disastrous as, for instance, Waco under Janet Reno. I mean, and you can argue, look, Gonzales is a worse, Janet Reno didn't intend for Waco to end the way it did, and
Right.
and Alberto Gonzales did intend to dramatically politicize the Justice Department. But at the same time, it's I guess it's apples and oranges in a way.
Well, I mean, but there's also, if you put together his tenure as White House counsel and the torture memos and his role in that, I mean, it vastly exceeds Waco.
That's true. Although again,
which was really a kind of botched operation at the very beginning of a new administration, and I don't.
Well, I think it's a testament to his own mediocrity, though, that even if he is the worst, he's worst in the sense of, he only is the worst in the sense that he's just a conduit for other people, for things that you can trace to other people within the administration. Right. He has no agency of his own to speak of.
Right. I mean, if you worked in an office with him, he'd be the sort of affable guy down the hall.
Yeah.
And probably medium harmless. Palmer raids. That's what I was
yeah.
Palmer was another bad attorney general. So yeah, I mean, I was sort of suggesting that maybe all this was a distraction from the Petraeus report, which seems to have lost all its importance in the last couple of weeks as we've sort of cranked up the Vietnam analogies instead. I mean, you and your co-bloggers.
Do you think? Well, before we get into the Vietnam analogies, I mean, do you think that it's lost all its importance?
I think the substance. I mean, it's hard to imagine that the substance of that report now
will be that different from what's in the NIE. It'll
right.
Just be a
it's not.
of
I just don't see it as. I just don't see it now as a. I think that the sort of momentum of we must wait until General Petraeus speaks has just lost some of its momentum. I mean, we kind of know what's going to be in there. There'll be claims that the violence is going down. There's no, you can't claim anything about the political situation, which gets more chaotic every day. And I think a lot of the claims about the violence going down are obviously going to be, localized and selective. And the report itself may not have any credibility once you know that it's all been doctored and played with. By various people. So but
don't you think the significance of this? I mean, I feel like we always knew, roughly what the report was going to say. It was going to say, I think 3 months ago it was pretty clear, barring some enormous upsurge in violence or some remarkable political breakthrough, that the report would say violence is down somewhat, gains are being made, they aren't showing up in the political side, and so on. It seems like the significance of the date has always been whether people, and particularly some Republican senators, use it as an excuse to bail.
Right.
And don't you? And it seems to still have significance in that sense. It's still the moment when, August is over, Congress is back, the media is zeroed in again, and if there's going to be a break in the wall of opposition that prevented the previous Democratic attempts. At bringing the war to an end in some form, then this is when it would happen. I mean, do you think that that's changed? Do you think it's just a case where you're just going to have the same lineup on either side as you did a few months ago?
No, I mean, I think that Republicans might use it as an excuse to break, but I don't think there's anything in the substance of the report that's going to affect that.
Oh yeah, no.
I mean, the report will be the report, and Republicans will that will be the day. And they might hold their fire until that day. But what will determine whether they break or not is essentially, how rough a time they get back home, and and whether they're up for re-election or not. And you do a little math with those factors, and that determines whether they're going to break. And I think a significant number of them are going to break. And I don't think at this point there's anything. If they produced a report that would be a strong argument for not breaking, it wouldn't be a credible report. It would be laughed. It would be laughed at, given what we actually know.
Maybe this is a function of my being inside the Washington bubble, but I've actually been impressed with the extent to which the proponents of the surge have, they have maybe not shifted the conversation, but have made the case that the surge is working a significant part of the dialogue, within the media and within the sort of, whatever the world where such dialogues take place. I think the surge is working narrative is more powerful now than I expected it to be 3 months ago. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I guess with the O'Hanlon and Pollock op-ed obviously was the best attempt to make that case. I mean, I think it was always obvious that the surge might work in certain localized areas for a certain short period of time, but as the sort of grand step that would push this country back from chaos and the sort of strategic intervention that would get the cycle moving back in the other direction, I don't think anybody's really making the case that it has worked, and that's what it was supposed to be. I mean, it was kind of like we do this one big thing. It wasn't a surge just for the sake of surge. It was a surge to sort of get things back on track. And I don't, absent the political agreement, and B, absent reductions in violence in other areas, I don't think there's. It's a hard claim to make. I mean,
well, then let's go on.
The bigger problem is like coming to terms with the consequences of leaving. And that, I think, is an interesting factor. Brian Baird, congressman from Washington, who was out there, came back and said, I'm kind of against the timetable because I think leaving would create such a catastrophe. And that's not wrong. I mean, for a long, as long as Bush isn't going to do it, the surge isn't going to work, and you can have the sort of Bill Richardson approach of I've got a 3-point plan, which is leave, or I've got a 1-point plan, or whatever. Right. You can hold. If you think something wasn't worth, shouldn't have been done in the first place. I mean, you could take that position. The more you come close to the reality of it, the more you have to really engage with how are you going to go about this leaving.
Right, which is where, and that's where the Vietnam analogies come in.
Right. And that's where I think that, here's my point about the Vietnam analogy. Everybody's done fascinating work in dismantling all the analogies that Bush used last week. And of course they're all highly misleading and all that. But what I think is, I think this is a case of the liberal vice is always this literalism. There are Vietnam analogies, they're incorrect. We go to the history books, we show they're incorrect. It didn't have anything to do with Vietnam. What Bush was doing was invoking the idea that liberals, the opponents of the Vietnam War, might have been right, but it ruined the Democratic Party. That the Democratic Party paid the price for being right. And that's an argument that Jacob Weisberg made that last year in regard to Ned Lamont's campaign and some things like that. It's almost like conventional wisdom, that being right about Vietnam, won some congressional elections for Democrats in 1974, won the presidency for Jimmy Carter, but that was the end of it. And the burden of that post-war period falling on Democrats, and the burden of seeming to be, being right but being on the side of withdrawal was destructive for Democrats, and that's what he was trying to invoke. And whether the literal analogies to Vietnam work or not, it's sort of just like saying, look, we can write the story that will destroy you. After.
So you think he was trying to invoke it as a message to Democrats?
As a message to Democrats, and there's a quote that Josh Marshall pulled up from The Guardian where, he quoted somebody as saying, in the White House they're saying this speech was targeted at the defeatocrats on Capitol Hill, and I think it was absolutely targeted to sort of scaring the bejesus out of Democrats. And then you can sort of say to the Republicans, look, the Democrats are terrified, we'll destroy them if we hold firm behind this viewpoint. We will destroy them politically. And it's the first, in a sense, it's like the first speech of the post-war.
Yeah, I think that's wrong.
Okay.
And maybe this is just, maybe I'm a little naive in this sense, but I think that, it's clear that, conservatives have employed and are employing and will continue to employ rhetoric that suggests that liberals and other defeatists right and left have undermined our effort in Iraq and have contributed to our defeat. And certainly, if and when we leave Iraq, that narrative will exist on the right and will be employed, and maybe it'll be employed successfully. I'm skeptical about that too. But I think liberals in sort of trying to game out, well, what is George W. Bush really saying, or what is Bill Kristol really saying, and aren't they just setting themselves up for the post-Iraq period? I think they're missing the extent to which the American right is actually invested intellectually in the narrative that Bush put forward about Vietnam. And I think that liberals should not underestimate the extent to which conservatives really do believe that Vietnam was, if not a winnable war in some complete sense, a war in which we should not have, we should not have abandoned the South Vietnamese the way we did in 1973 to 1975, that, we had made substantial gains between the Tet Offensive and 1973, and that had domestic politics been different, we could have, preserved an independent South Vietnam. I think that that's something that conservatives believe, and I think it's something that, affects what conservatives believe about Iraq right now. I don't think conservatives consider the war in Iraq lost. I think that they think that, I think that they think that we should stay, and if we stay, it is possible to salvage something somewhat successful from the wreckage. Now, they may be wrong about this. I'm inclined to think that they are wrong, but I think that it's a real belief on the right, and it's a powerful driver.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's a scary thought. It's interesting. I mean, I think that the history of that belief would be an interesting one to trace, because I think it took about. I mean, I think in a sense, it's a lot of that belief is revisionism from the probably Max Boot gets some credit for popularizing that belief. I mean, I think it's probably in the last decade or so that's taken hold. I'm not sure that was the belief on the right in the late 70s, early 80s.
I'm not sure either, and I think it's an interesting question, the extent to which, too, I think conservatives also do believe the argument that you just put forward, which is that the Democrats, by being right about Vietnam, cost themselves the next 15 years or something in American politics. I'm not sure that that's right. I think that a lot of conservatives think that, part of why Reagan won was that Americans felt like we could have won in Vietnam and didn't. And you hear invocations of whichever Rambo movie it is where he goes to Vietnam and somebody says, "Do we get to win this time?" or something. Yeah. I mean, look, I wasn't alive during that era, so it's hard for me to say. But my read on that is that it's possible to imagine a very different Carter administration and very different events in the late 1970s that would have led to an outcome in which, had Ronald Reagan run as he did in 1980, that the Republicans wouldn't have won, or at least wouldn't have had that kind of advantage on foreign policy. Right. And the root of their advantage, I mean, it's all complicated because everything is bound up in everything else. Had we not lost the way we did in Vietnam, other events around the world would have fallen out differently. Right. From the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to the Iranian Revolution to more minor third world things that made America look weak in different ways. And what's definitely true, I think, is that what the Vietnam War did was it empowered certain elements within the Democratic Party that then their empowerment contributed to the Democrats' defeat in 1980 and 84 and so on. Right. I just don't think that the American people ever had anything close to buyer's remorse about Vietnam itself. Right,
that's right. Right, which is, I mean, I think there are two things to say about that. One, I mean, that I was alive during that period, and that feeling of, of total ineffectiveness in the world that kind of took hold in the late 70s had a lot more to do with the oil crises and Iran and the economy. I mean, that's when the economy really turned on the middle class. Had a lot more to do with those factors than with a sense about Vietnam. Although Vietnam had broken down the Vietnam played a big role in the loss of morale in the military.
Right.
Certainly. And the other point, of course, is that, Vietnam destroyed Vietnam did, to a large degree, destroy the Democratic Party because it was, as Bob Dole would put it, a Democrat war. I mean, it created a massive internal fissure in the Democratic Party that played out in 68 and played out in 72 and was kind of gone by 76, but the factions were all still there. So that a lot of the myth that Vietnam hurt the Democratic Party is often bound up in the idea in the ideas that led to neoconservatism, which is, if you hadn't if the liberal faction if the McGovern faction had not prevailed, the saintly Scoop Jackson would have been the Democratic nominee in 1972 or 1976, and all would have been well with the world. And then Scoop Jackson, of course, is where you get Richard Pearl from, and it goes straight into neoconservatism. And there are many things that are crazy about this myth, including the fact, Scoop Jackson. It's not like Scoop Jackson was almost the Democratic nominee, but got robbed by the left. He didn't win any primaries. Nobody voted for him. He was just another senator who didn't click as a presidential candidate. So there's a little bit of this is mythology, but it definitely did have an impact on the. It is definitely sort of the defining story, a defining part of the story of the decline of the Democratic Party into the 70s in a way that Iraq can't possibly be.
Well, right, because as you said, it's not a Democrat war.
Right. I mean, we can get it's even hard. I mean, I think at this point, one of the interesting things that I think is happening in the Democratic primary, in the Democratic race, which we weren't really going to talk about too much, but is that in a sense it's like the period in which the differences on Iraq were really going to be pounded away on has kind of faded. I mean, the difference between there's still a distinct difference between Hillary Clinton and the refusal to sort of apologize, and the others, and Edwards voting for it and going pretty far to the I mean, those differences still exist, but it's like as much advantage as can be milked out of them has already been milked.
Right.
I mean, everybody's basically going to do the same thing and deal with begin to deal with the complexity of it and the fringe
until they win, and then I think the more interesting question for the Democrats, and admittedly, this assumes victory for them in 2008.
Right.
But my assumption is that we will still be involved in some fashion in Iraq come 2012,
right.
And that's the point at which the Democrats that's when the fissures start to come back, and that's the point where you can imagine, particularly to a somewhat unpopular Democratic incumbent, a primary challenger predicated on a more radical left isolationist platform. I mean, that may not happen, and obviously incumbents tend to be very strong in primaries, and but even if it's a Pat Buchanan in 1992 type figure, I don't know. Right. I mean, I think that I think the goal for the Democrats is, obviously it's their goal, it's their stated goal, but is to get out of Iraq.
Right. But I think all the three front runners have left themselves enough room. They're not. Dodd, and it's only the second tier.
Oh no, they've left themselves enough room.
Yeah.
But I think there's an understanding in the Democratic anti-war base that yes, they've left themselves room, but they are going to get us out of Iraq.
Right. That's right.
And if they don't, and I think it's quite likely that they won't, there may be political consequences. I mean, we'll see. It's all we're talking 5 years down the road. So
right. I mean, I think you'd have whatever you do, you have to undertake a huge transformation of how involve the UN much more. I mean, you just need a kind of fresh start of how we're approaching it.
Yeah.
And I think if you had that sense of a fresh start of how you're approaching it and much lower troop levels, I think people could live with that.
Right. I just think this is bound up in the larger problem of Iraq. I mean, I think that we do gain some modest credibility in the world community and the UN and so on by electing a Democrat and having a fresh start and so on, and there will be avenues to pursue. But you're still left with the problem. And Max Boot wrote a long piece in the latest commentary. I don't know if you saw it, but it's
I'm not a regular commentary reader.
You're not a regular commentary reader? Well,
I have been in my life,
as a regular commentary reader, I'll summarize it for you. It's basically an extended critique of all the options for withdrawal or redeployment in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And, it's a smart piece. It comes to, of course, the conclusion that, we need to support the temporary surge and hope for the political process to succeed and so on, which I think is probably wishful thinking at this point, and it's not much of a policy, and that's why I think in the long run the proponents of withdrawal/redeployment are going to win the argument. Mm-hmm. But once they win the argument, you're still faced with the fact that all our options are bad.
Right.
And because all our options are bad, sure, President Obama can draw us down to 80,000 troops, but all that may mean is that we have 80,000 troops sort of moving in and out of a country that's even more violent than what we have today. And I think that there is there is going to be profound resistance in such a situation to full withdrawal, and for good reason.
Yeah. Yep. No, it's making that transition from just being the out of power party that could say we should never have done this in the first place,
right,
to this gruesome task, and preparing people for it. And that's where the late 70s is an interesting period to think about, because that's what Carter never quite successfully did, was kind of create a politics for a kind of era of limits and an era of declining influence in the world, and a way to make something of that. And then the Reagan-esque optimism came in and managed to claim the day for a while. And that question of could the politics of the late 70s have been very different is a fascinating one to me.
Yeah, and it may be that they just couldn't have been, in the sense that somebody, as long as a Democrat was president, some of those, particularly the economic shocks, were going to happen anyway, and so forth. Carter's particular approach to global affairs, and I know that he eventually upped defense spending and so on, but it was a little bit too consonant with his projection of weakness was very consonant with America's actual weakness, which was not really what you needed, I think, at that juncture. But you were there and I wasn't, so
it wasn't like I was in the White House or anything. I was a mere child.
I'll go down the hall and find, Jim Fallows is in China, so I can't track him down.
Yeah, he bears a little responsibility for that. We didn't talk about, what we didn't put on the list to talk about was the speechwriter battle.
Oh, well,
which is
that's
now
sort
a couple weeks ago and played out in your...
In our pages, the Atlantic, we ran Matthew Scully, a former Bush speechwriter, right, taking on Michael Gerson, his former colleague, for being a glory hound, a credit monger, and someone who never missed an opportunity to take credit for work that he often hadn't done. And since it's sort of an in-house thing, I probably shouldn't express too many strong opinions on it. But if you'd like to express an opinion on that piece, go for
the
it.
The opinion that I had was best expressed, I think, just yesterday or a couple days ago by Michael Kinsley, which is kind of like, is that all you got? A little bit of. There are a couple little good little anecdotes in there, like that. Like the line about how he left his colleagues to actually write a speech while he went down to Starbucks to be photographed pretending to write a speech.
I thought that was a pretty vivid...
It's a pretty vivid image, but it's kind of like, I don't know. Millions of offices could have little... everybody has their little gripes and their little issues. It just seemed very, very thin gruel to make a whole article of. It's kind of and in every situation somebody's the person whose name and somebody else does all the work. I know I used to know a little bit. What's his name? Who was the lesser known of the Reagan speechwriters, Tony Dolan, and it's all the Reagan speeches are credited to there's another Reagan speechwriter whose name I'm forgetting. But
Peter Robinson?
Or Peter
Michael,
Robinson.
did
Those
Michael
are the people
Deaver
who are out
write?
there and get themselves well known, whereas Dolan was the guy who was sort of grinding it out all the time. And you know what, I remember he told me, because I went to work for Bill Bradley as my first job was a speechwriter, and Dolan's advice, which was totally irrelevant to a Senate office, was like, you know, you think you're there to craft words, you're really there to kind of manage the bureaucracy, and the real work is managing all these people who want their little claims in speeches, and it's not about writing. It's a bureaucracy job, which I thought was an interesting.
Yeah, I
An
mean,
interesting
well,
point. It sounded like Gerson kind of managed that really well by having this image that he was the guy and had this relationship with Bush. Kind of actually gives you the power to manage all the little pieces that are not just the speechwriting office, but all the pieces all the power centers that want a piece of that speech.
Yeah, that's possible. I guess. All right, I'll speak quickly in defense then of the piece,
Okay.
in my role as representative of the Atlantic. I mean, I think that part of what makes the piece interesting is as a commentary, frankly, on the press and how. I mean, I wasn't around in the 1980s. Maybe the
When were you
coverage
born?
of Peggy.
1990?
Well, no, I was around. I was around in the 1980s. I wasn't following the inside DC coverage of Peggy Noonan, but I followed things in the 90s and
Right,
so on.
right.
I think it's fair to say that it's hard to imagine a presidential speechwriter getting more media attention and more extended fawning profiles than Michael Gerson did.
Right.
And I think as not even necessarily as a commentary on him so much as a commentary on the desire of reporter after reporter, including many reporters I know and like, to believe a particular narrative about Gerson.
Right.
That was an ideal way for them to cover the White House.
Right, that's right. And it also helped give a lot of credibility to the idea that there was something to compassionate conservatism.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
was this, person
this compassionate
who's
conservative,
compassionate and conservative, and in a sense, this was one more nail in that coffin.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that with any piece like this, you have the difficulty that the only person who sort of can tell you the inside story of Michael Gerson inevitably looks. There's no way to write a piece like that without having it look petty to some extent. And I think Kinsley made some good points, but I still like the piece a lot.
Yeah. Well, I
say that as soon as I heard it was out, I like Michael Gerson. I've never. I don't think he's found his rhythm as a Washington Post columnist, but as I think, and I also think, to the extent that I think it's good to have the Washington Post op-ed page represent the diversity of voices within American politics, I think Michael Gerson speaks very well for a, I guess, underspoken for constituency in American life, and I'm glad to see him with that platform.
Okay. Well, if the Washington Post did make an effort to represent the diversity of opinions, that might not be where I'd start, but that's all right. I mean, if they start there and then add some other kinds of voices, that would be great. But you mean
like anti-war right-wing Catholics, right? You want Andrew Bacevich to have a column,
something like that. Well,
something like that. Maybe Ron Paul.
Yeah. Something. I mean, there's a lot of views.
Once they add Mark Schmitt and Ross Douthat, I think it would be safe.
We would make very good columnists, and maybe someday we will be sitting up there and lambasting those nasty bloggers who won't leave us alone.
Yeah, those bloggers. Seriously.
Someday, high Douthatism will become a phrase like high broderism.
So, do you want to finish up on a lighter note by talking about a TV show? Yeah, I
want to finish up on a lighter note and talk about TV a little bit, because I watch so little TV and I watch so few movies, and that's also part of the two classes, of course, of Washington. But I have been watching some of Mad Men, and you wrote it, and this is going to bring out another little generational difference, I think. Because you wrote a little piece saying, well, you finally watched it, but you thought it went overboard with the things that reminded you, this is 1960.
Yeah, well, there was a whole. This is one of those layered blogging kind of arguments. So that Mad Men got all this, raving media attention. Everybody loved it. And then Sasha Zimmerman wrote a, hey, wait a minute piece for the New Republic Online, which said, a lot of different things, some of which may have been unfair. But I just sat down and watched the premiere episode, and yes, precisely that part of her piece rang true to me. The idea that, in the first episode alone, you have endless jokes like, the guy says, oh, I know you stole the documents from me because it's not like we have some magic copy machine sitting around the office. And there were at least 3 or 4 direct things like that, and then sort of endless indirect things like, okay, we get it. This ad company is trying to sell us Richard Nixon and cigarettes. People in 1960 didn't really know a lot, did they? Right. So anyway, so what's the generational difference?
No, well, see, to me, all of that was. I was born in the 60s, and we all obsess with, especially once you have kids, you're sort of reminded of all those things that our parents did, from the passive smoke, the drinking while they were pregnant, all that stuff that put our lives at risk. And what's funny about the show is it pounds every one of those home all the time. There's one great passage where the daughter of of Don Draper, in the little suburban house in Ossining, the daughter runs into the room with a plastic bag from the dry cleaner over her head, over her whole body. She's inside the plastic bag, and her mother says, "Young lady, if that bag on your head means that my dry cleaning is on the floor, you're going to be in big trouble." And the girl runs off with the bag still on her head. And I think it's sort of a reminder to our generation that this vanity we have, that maybe our IQs would be higher if our parents hadn't drunk while we were in the womb and all that. We're just lucky to be alive. I mean, the amount of drinking driving drunk and throwing the kids in the back seat, on those bench seats of the old cars, and the kids would just flop around there and get into fights and throw things around while you're driving on the highway, and it's just one thing after another, and that's you have to overdo it, I think, to sort of drive the point home. It's all about atmosphere and imagery, and of course, New York in 1960 is to me just a fabulous time and place. So I don't mind, I think, overdoing
So you like it for its...
for the overdoing of that. Mm-hmm. For the, and it's almost, and it becomes almost like a comic note of like, okay, what incredibly stupid thing are they going to do now? Well, it's going to put everybody's lives at risk, and everybody survives. Everybody, and in the end, the reality is everybody's fine. Yes, some kids are going to die when they put plastic bags over their heads, but most of them aren't.
Well, it's interesting because I guess, and having only watched one episode, I'm at a disadvantage. But it also gets at what kind of show it is, because I'd read the rave reviews, and it's from one of the writers of The Sopranos and so on, and so it may be that I went into it expecting something that was a little more serious and a little less satirical, I guess. Yeah. And to the extent that that is a real line, and to the extent that you're doing a satire, things like that become, I think, much more acceptable or even dramatically necessary.
Well, I'm not sure it's a satire. It's just a sort of it's got a satirical layer to it. Underneath.
Right. No, I just felt like that layer. And again, just first episode, that layer was really, really thick.
Oh, yeah.
It seemed like, for instance, in the first episode, there's the scene where, Draper, the main character, goes out to drinks with the Jewish female department store owner, who she's a potential client, and they have this conversation that's clearly supposed to be a window into his character and sort of anomie and the darkness at the heart of the American dream or something, where he's talking about like getting ahead in life and so on. I forget exactly what he says, but all I could think about throughout that whole scene was how annoyingly unrealistic I found it that in the previous scene he's summoned in to try and sell her on on having them run the ad account for her store, and all he does is insult her for being a woman.
Right.
And I'm inclined to believe that obviously people were sexist in 1959. I found it really hard to believe that a high-flying ad executive looking at a really big account would be like, I can't continue this conversation because you're a woman.
I think that's right. That was a weird scene, I think, which later on, I've watched a couple of other episodes, I think later on begins to make a little more sense.
Okay.
Maybe as you do it. But no, and in a sense, it's, I think in a way, I want to ask my mother about this. I think she worked in an ad agency for a little while. She mostly worked in publishing. I think we can't fully grasp the sexism of that period. What it was to be a woman in an office in business or something like that in that period, I think is much harder than we can even imagine.
And maybe you need to to do that kind of establishing through overemphasis the difference between then and now. It's interesting. Right. I know you said when we talked earlier you haven't seen Big Love. I've been watching the second season of Big Love. I'm a little bit behind, but watching it on demand. But it was interesting for me to see Mad Men after seeing so much of Big Love, because Big Love is it's about a Mormon polygamous family in Utah that's trying to blend in suburbia, and it walks a similar line between it's a different kind of satire between essentially playing the absurdity of their situation and the situation back at the compound where they've sort of escaped from, where you have the hardcore polygamists, playing that for kind of condescending laughter and playing it very seriously. And when I started watching the show, I thought it was just I had a similar experience maybe to the first episode of Mad Men, where I was like, this is just a sort of annoying satire that's both making fun of them and clearly trying to use them to make fun of Red America more broadly. But I think Big Love has actually turned into something much richer and more interesting than that, which is maybe the most sympathetic show about religious conservatives that I've seen maybe ever. And obviously, it's still satirizing them at the same time because they are polygamists, and they are in this ridiculous situation. But it's just it's interesting to watch shows walk that line.
Right, and that may be the secret for the kind of television that that kind of format is have. And I think that was true of Sopranos as well. Have a certain element of satire and a certain and then edge it over towards something that you're much. It's the sort of post-irony generation way of easing you into seriousness, and then having something that's sustainable over time without being too much of either one. But
so I should keep watching Mad Men, you're saying?
I would suggest you keep watching that. I might watch Big Love, but it's just for me. It's like you might want to watch a show about religious conservatives, and I prefer to watch a show about crazy people in New York in 1960.
They might not be all that different, though.
Right.
Underneath, we're all just people.
I think on that note, we need to end this Blogging Heads. Under the skin, we're all just the same.
All right. On that, we can agree.
Okay.
So, a pleasure talking to you, Mark, as
Likewise.
always.
Okay, be well.